Hello, welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, hosted by me, Jack Perks. Professionally, I'm a wildlife cameraman, but I dabble in podcasting, and each Tuesday we release an episode as I have a chat with scientists, artists, filmmakers, and passionate people all about nature in a light-hearted and certainly not serious way. Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host, Jack Perks. This week my guest is Tom Lathan and we're talking about his book Lost Wonders. The book is 10 tales of extinction from the 21st century. So many of us think of animals in the far past when it comes to extinction, not necessarily stuff that we've lost really in the last 20 years or so. So it's a fascinating chat with Tom. Before I do that, I'm going to mention buymeacoffee.com. This podcast is completely independent. The only way that I keep going is via you, the listener, donating. And you can do so via buymeacoffee.com. I'm only asking for the price of a cup of tea or a pint, about a fiver, and it's a one-off payment. It means that I can be independent, I can say and do what I want, I don't have to be beholden to advertisers, and it means that you get a far more interesting podcast. If you can't pay, don't worry about it. Someone else is paying so that you can listen for free. But if you can share the podcast or you can write a review, that is greatly appreciated. There's a link in the description if you feel so inclined to do that. Let's get to our chat with Tom today. I had a ball talking to him. It was really interesting. It was quite a deep conversation because, quite frankly, these animals ain't coming back. There's a finality to it. So it was really interesting chatting to him about why these animals have gone extinct, why they're so important, and some of the other factors that he talks about in the book. Here's our chat. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thanks very much, Jack. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, how are you doing? You all good?
I'm good. Yeah, very good. I haven't done one of these in a little while, though, so I'm a bit rusty. I had to figure out how to use Zoom again. But
Yeah, no, I get that a lot. During the kind of lockdown days, everyone was a pro at this, and now people are getting a bit behind. Do you want to just explain kind of who you are and your background before we kind of get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Tom Lathan, and I'm a journalist and author. I've been writing, I've been covering books on the natural world actually for a fair few years now for newspapers and magazines. And Lost Wonders is my first book, which is, I don't know if you want me to go into explaining what it is.
Yeah, you can do. Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
in it'll be in the title for this. So yeah, if you want to explain the book as well, that's fine.
Yeah, so Lost Wonders is it's basically a book about species that have very recently gone extinct. So the idea was to really write about extinction as a in the present tense. So extinction as a concept, I think, is something that many of us first come across when we're young in a museum or watching Jurassic Park or something like that. In a way, it kind of on a subconscious level, I think it very much sort of feels like something of the past. You know, the figureheads of extinction are things like dodos and dinosaurs. But I really wanted to write a book that situated it in the present. So it's telling the stories of 11 species that have gone extinct since the turn of the millennium. So the idea is everyone reading it will have, memories and will have be able to kind of look back over that time where all of us have, lived during that time that these species have gone extinct.
So how did you narrow down? You say 11?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's 11 species, but there's 10 chapters.
Got you. Okay,
So
right. That's where I'm mixing it up.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, how? Because obviously, I presume rather sadly that you could have picked a lot more species.
Yes.
So how did you narrow it down to those 11?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first came to the idea of writing about extinct species, I very much thought that I was going to be able to sort of pick and choose. I thought that that it wouldn't be kind of dictated for me. But basically what happened is when I first started thinking about writing about extinction, I contacted the IUCN, which is the global body that oversees the conservation status of everything, basically in the natural world. And I asked them for a list of recent extinctions. And what they sent me back was, covering the last 500 years. So there were hundreds and hundreds of entries, from all over the planet. But there were 11 in particular that kind of really popped out. And it was these species that had basically been declared extinct since the millennium, but they'd also been seen So someone had interacted with them in some way, shape, or form since the year 2000. And it's kind of very much decided for me in that sense because those 11 were there. And my kind of immediate reaction was as I was going through the list, one of the dates popped out at me, which is the 26th of August, which is my birthday. And it's the date that one of the species, the Christmas Island pipistrelle, which is a tiny species of bat that lived on Christmas Island, that went extinct on the 26th of August, 2009. And the fact that I could kind of look back through Facebook and through my emails and things like that and see what I'd been doing, what I'd been thinking, what, family and friends had been doing, was such a profound thought. It kind of struck me the immediacy of this. So that's really where the idea for the book came from in that kind of experience. And I hope it's something that readers will be able to see as well when they read the book. They'll be able to look back through their own lives.
Yeah, well, like you say, it is obviously not that long ago. And what's the reactions? Because you're talking to people who've interacted with these animals. Like, what's their are they really upset? Are they not surprised? Like, what's the kind of mix of emotions that you're typically getting with them?
It's a whole range, really. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, I think most of these people they knew where things were heading. I
yeah,
mean, when you when you get into a situation where you've got obviously when you've only got one of a species left, unless it's something like a snail or something that can reproduce asexually, then you've just got an endling. Unless there's the possibility that there's another one out there, which is the case with some of the species. But in most cases, their population is so tiny that inbreeding is a problem, and the chances of success are really kind of really tiny. But the kind of inspiring thing about that is that none of these people gave up,
yeah.
even with the smallest of odds. There are examples like there's a snail. It's not actually the snail I wrote about, but it's closely related to it. So it was being cared for by the same conservationists. So they didn't succeed with the snail that I wrote about. But this other snail, they had one left, and they managed to bring it back to a population of 400 from that single snail.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So the really amazing thing about it is, although these stories came to a tragic end, interwoven within them there are these success stories, and that these conservationists are always kind of learning from things that don't work out. Sorry, what was your question again? I don't know where we started.
It was the emotions that people have who
Yes.
have worked with them. Sorry, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's yeah, so like I was saying, a real mixture. So on the one hand, there is this kind of sense, I think, that a lot of these species are sort of they're almost certainly doomed a lot of the time.
Yeah, the people know what the outcome's going to be. They're sort of prepared for
Exactly.
it a little
I mean,
bit.
the
Yeah,
people who are doing this, they're scientists, so then they're not, they know the
yeah,
odds of what they're dealing with, but they're kind of eternally hopeful at the same time. I think because they perceive the significance of a species going extinct. It's just such an enormous event.
yeah,
So even when the odds are incredibly dismal, it's worth the fight. And then another thing that really struck me is some of the people who'd witnessed a species going extinct in their care would describe a sense of loneliness, of being the only person who really understood.
yeah,
So there's a chap, an ichthyologist called Chris Martin, who one of the species in my book is a tiny species of fish that lived in a single lagoon in Mexico, and that went extinct in 2015 in his laboratory. So he had the last fish in the world, and he he described to me that sense of, he had people in his life who kind of supported him, his partner, his family, colleagues, but really there was no one else who'd actually been in his position with this fish, especially with the kind of scientific background of really understanding the long, millions of years of evolution, and understanding what that means. They couldn't understand. So yeah,
no,
he really was alone with this kind of experience.
yeah. I'd never really considered that aspect of it, but I suppose yeah, because you talk to people about these species, because chances are these species that are going extinct. the wider public haven't got a clue what they are.
Yes.
So trying to put the stress upon them that yeah, this thing's going to be gone, and once it's gone forever.
Mm.
Quite deep, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
But at the same time, I think that for as many as, as often as there are those experiences like that, and there were many, people who I think witnessing an extinction can be a really life-changing event for people. It really does kind of stay with them. But at the same time, I think that it also fuels a fire.
yeah,
That there are lessons learned, not just in terms of how to approach the conservation of similar species, but actually there's a lesson learned in terms of that kind of resilience and determination to not allow that to happen again,
yeah,
which is where I think in each of these stories there is a kind of there are those silver linings. They're deeply sad stories, but there's also so much hope because you see the extraordinary ends that people go to, and the determination
yeah.
that
I don't suppose you. I mean, this might be a silly question to ask, but I don't suppose you got to see any before they went extinct, or the whole. I guess
no.
the whole point of the book is they've already gone extinct, isn't it? But
I didn't. I did actually. I met the species, after they'd passed. In terms of, I
right.
went to visit the type specimen. So
Oh, okay.
the type specimen is the example that was essentially used to categorize the species. So a lot of the time, these are 100 years plus old, sitting in a jar of alcohol or the modern equivalent in a museum. But the interesting thing is, in one case in my book, a species of rat called the Bramblecay melomys, the people that I spoke to about that, the two conservationists who were fighting to save it, they'd actually never seen it either,
Oh, right.
which is
Okay.
fascinating. I mean, yeah, I mean, this thing was so imperiled by the time they actually got involved, it hadn't been seen for a while, and they they went to this tiny sand cay in the Indian Ocean called Bramble Cay, which is only a few meters above sea level. And this, people listening may have heard of this story because it was the first mammalian extinction determined to be. Oh, sorry, I'll try that again. Um, it was the first mammalian extinction determined to be being caused by anthropogenic climate change. So it was a real kind of bellwether of the impact that we're having on the natural world. So that species went extinct as a result of the sea inundating this tiny island. But before, or the years following that, these two researchers just spent so much time, such an extensive search looking for this species that had already gone, they determined in the end.
Because it must be so hard. Like when do you kind of cut it off? Like obviously, I suppose it's a little bit easier if you've literally got one in captivity in a lab or a zoo or something. But when do you go, right? We're pretty sure it's not in the wild anymore. It must be quite difficult to be able to tick that off because I guess there's always going to be that grey. Like people talk about, oh, we saw a thylacine or whatever in Australia. So it must be quite tricky to kind of say that it's extinct.
Yeah, I mean the IUCN they leave a grace period, so
Okay.
very often you can read about species that scientists essentially, as far as they can tell, they know that it's gone extinct. An example would be the baiji, which is a Chinese river dolphin.
Yeah.
There have been books written about this. Sam Turvey, who wrote a wonderful book about this species. I think it was something like 2006. He wrote this book around then. He knew back then that species isn't officially listed as extinct. And it depends on the species, but depends on the certitude with which people can look at a habitat and say, okay, this is definitely gone.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
with a dolphin, that's quite tricky. It's difficult to survey that environment. And sometimes a species will pop up, will turn up again, and you have these extraordinary reversals of fortune.
Yeah, they're often kind of a nice, I say positive because you don't know population numbers, but you'll often see it on BBC News or whatever. Something might just pop, oh,
Yeah,
rediscovered, mountain rat or something,
yeah.
or bird of paradise or whatever. So, yeah, it's, I suppose, yeah, there's nature. To quote, you mentioned Jurassic Park earlier. To quote, nature finds a way. Sometimes things do pop back, don't they? Which is
Yeah.
nice. Um,
One of the species in the book is actually a good example of that. Or so the Pinta Island tortoise, which is a species of Galapagos giant tortoise. The last of that species was world famous conservation icon called Lonesome George. He
Okay,
lived
yeah,
in
I've heard of
captivity.
George.
You've heard of George,
I
yeah.
know George. Well, I don't know him, but I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's the kind of celebrity species in my book. He was in captivity for nearly 40 years.
Wow.
He had hundreds of thousands of visitors over those decades. And when he died, his species was declared extinct. A couple of years ago, however, they discovered a giant tortoise that had shared half its genes with the Pinter Island tortoise, which may mean that there is another Pinter Island tortoise out there somewhere. They haven't found it yet, but it
Ah,
raises that possibility. It's a hybrid.
okay.
So that's really intriguing. So there's there's a sense sometimes species can kind of pop up and come back, but in all other cases in the book, it's the door is closed.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I get that. I mean, you've kind of already talked about it, but like, what was your thinking in concentrating on the 21st century? Because I know what you're kind of saying. Like, everyone thinks of dinosaurs and mammoths and stuff, but obviously, you've chosen species which have gone extinct much sooner than that.
Hmm. It really is just the immediacy. I mean,
Yeah.
we're in this situation now where I think, I'm sure your listeners are probably quite attuned to this point of view, but we do need to change the way that humanity thinks and feels and acts about and towards the natural world. There needs to be a revolution of thought. And so I think part of that is that the more we talk about these stories, the more we talk about extinction that's happening around us right now, the more we make people aware of that. And also, by the same token, the more we talk about the other option, which is that we know how to solve these problems. These extinctions were preventable.
Hmm.
There were there were errors of judgment in every single case at the level of government or individuals. All it takes really is, which is something I draw a lot of hope from, is that all it takes is a change of culture towards the natural world, towards extinction, for us to have different outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think so. If I'm going to play devil's advocate, you'll get people who are not so as attuned to nature, and they'll go, "Why does it matter if a snail on some tropical island's gone extinct?" So what do we lose when these species do go extinct?
Mm. Well, there's different ways to approach that question.
Yeah.
It's something that I did. It's a question I raised to all of the experts I spoke to. Some of them were kind of dumbfounded, possibly a little bit offended that I was asking, but given they've dedicated their
Well,
lives to this
yeah,
kind of
no,
thing.
that's why I tried to word it delicately. But yeah,
No, yeah, of
basically,
course.
yeah.
No, I mean, that's part of the challenge that I think, we need to overcome. People who do feel like this is important, we do need to understand that there are many, many people who don't think the same way.
Hmm.
We all need to, or a majority of us need to feel like this is important if we're going to change the way things go. I would say there are different ways of looking at it. Obviously, we do derive various benefits from the natural world. Chemical compounds that are used in medicine. There are vast, pollinators is a good, there are many, many benefits that we derive from the natural world. It's a huge amount of our economy is actually driven by the natural world and the services it provides us. It's not just nice animals. There's a real economic benefit. But at the same time, there's another way to look at it, which is that these species are stories that have been ongoing for millions or tens of millions of years. And I think we all understand the tragedy when, say, an ancient artifact is mishandled or is destroyed on purpose. There's a great pouring out of emotion when Notre Dame Cathedral is on fire, because it's history, because it's something bigger than us. And I think that we should recognize that exactly the same thing is true for species. Elizabeth Colbert puts it really beautifully. She describes, I'm going to paraphrase, so I may butcher it, but apologies if she's listening, but she describes individual species as like instruction manuals for how to live on Earth. And I think that's so wonderful. we may not even fully understand it, but what we can understand is that these are ancient stories that are coming to a close. And sometimes, the benefits that these species might provide us, in a lot of cases, we'll never know,
Yeah.
because there are so many species that are estimated to go extinct every year without us even knowing that they exist, the so-called dark extinctions. And in those cases, who knows? Maybe a snail or a frog or whatever it is may have provided us with some kind of revolutionary cancer treatment. But for me, it's almost a philosophical issue that we're allowing these stories to end, and that's a great tragedy.
Yeah, I suppose another way to look at it, a more kind of simple way from my point of view, is if you think of the ecosystem being a bit like a Jenga game, and you
Mm,
just keep taking pieces out, that it can stay upright for a few, but eventually it's going to crumble. And the more we keep taking those pieces out, and that snail, that bat, that fish, whatever, it's still an important part of the puzzle that we want to kind of keep in there if we can. And it's a shame to let it all topple down. Um,
absolutely.
if we can't do that. What are the reasons? I mean, I imagine it's different for each one, but what are the reasons for these species going extinct? You mentioned the rat was climate change, but what about some of the others?
Yeah, so it's a range of different things. I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes it's habitat destruction. So to give an example, Plectostoma sciaphyllum, which is a minuscule snail the size of a sesame seed that lived only on a single hill in Malaysia, and that hill was completely quarried away to make cement in the early 2000s. Another one would be the fish I mentioned earlier that lived in a single lagoon. That lagoon was drained to irrigate fields for a globally popular brand of crisps. So
Are you reluctant to name that brand? Is that all?
yeah, unfortunately I can't name that brand, but
Okay.
I do know which one.
Okay.
So there's habitat destruction. There's also invasive species, which can either predate directly on a species or they can outcompete it. It can also be hunting, things like that. The top line cause really though is humans. It's
I was going to
us.
say I'm joining the dots and like
Yeah,
they're all linked to us, aren't they?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there are
Yeah.
other pressures that can come into it, but ultimately it's you see that's the first domino to fall is some kind of interaction that we've had, which is really devastating. But at the same time, it's we also possess the answers in all these
Yeah.
cases,
Yeah.
which is the other side of the coin.
Yeah, it's I guess do you think it's a case? I mean, I know that you talk about they all have value in their own right, but do you think that's a case of it displaying that to other people, showing like these are worth protecting because dot dot dot, trying to show people that they're not just something that we should ignore, like we
Mm.
need to protect them because, for whatever reason that may be.
I think it's important just
Yeah.
to, everyone's different.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who couldn't care less about some snail, right?
Yeah.
It's just a snail. But some of those people will stop dead in their tracks when they realize that, our economy is propped up by ecosystem services. When
Yeah.
they realize that if you were to actually remove the value that the natural world provides, human society would be crippled. So I think that we should talk about all of those different aspects. I think we'll reach people through different means,
Yeah.
but equally important,
Yeah.
equally important.
Yeah, I feel that. One of the things I know you've mentioned in your book, and I've heard touted around, and wonder if you can kind of explain a little bit more, is the Earth's sixth mass extinction. Because
Mm.
someone obviously familiar with the dinosaurs, which I think was at the fourth. I can't remember exactly the order of it, but and like that we might even be going through that right now. Is that correct? Have I got that right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about this notion of the sixth mass extinction and where exactly you kind of draw the boundary.
Yeah,
Some scientists would say we're kind of rapidly heading that way. Others would say we're kind of in the midst of it now. But it's it's basically to do with the number of species that are going extinct at that time. So, extinction is a natural process. It happens, it's part of evolution, but it's when there's that concentration, when there's that acceleration, and the natural world is unable to keep up basically with the changes that are going on, whatever that might be. And in the past, it's things like you know rapid changes to the atmosphere, to oxygen levels, things like that, or in the case of the dinosaurs, an asteroid. But right now, the consensus is we're the asteroid this time.
Yeah, yeah, we're definitely. It does seem to be when something does go belly up. It's generally it's our fault, isn't it? To completely 180 this conversation. When I was kind of reading up on you, Tom, one of the things I saw you were involved with bison in Kent, and rewilding is a common theme on the podcast. So I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that because I did obviously like extended family were like, did you know there's a load of bison running around Kent? I was like, well, I'm not quite, so I'm not sure they're just running around everywhere, but I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the last 3 years I've been volunteering for Kent Wildlife Trust, and basically my involvement is I've been working with their wildlife ecologist to collect data to ascertain the impact the bison are having, which gets to the heart of why they're there in the first place. So basically, large herbivores like bison, they have a kind of dramatic effect on woodland because they create essentially their own desire paths. If you put a bison in a forest, it's not necessarily going to go around a copse or go around a bunch of trees. It's going to go through it. And so the bison basically flatten trees, which creates deadwood, which is a enormously rich habitat for lots and lots of invertebrates, beetles and things like that, which obviously then feeds birds and other things. So they're real kind of ecosystem engineers. And the bison, I think what year they were introduced. I think they've been there as long as I've been there.
Right.
But yeah, they're really fascinating. They're not roaming around. They're
I was
in
going to say they're fenced in, aren't they?
They are
Yeah.
fenced in, yeah,
Okay.
because they're wild animals, so they have to, by law, they have to be fenced in.
Yeah.
Um, so they're in quite large enclosures, interconnected patches of forest, basically. So they have bison corridors where the bison can go underneath the road and get
All
to
right.
another part. Yeah,
Yeah.
um,
How many
they're
have they
very.
got?
I think they've got five. The
Five.
funny thing
Okay.
is, although I've been doing that for the last 3 years, I've only seen them once,
Oh, right.
which is amazing. Because being wild animals, they're very secretive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So they tend to keep away from us, and we try and keep away from them because the
Yeah.
idea is there to keep them wild. But there was a wonderful surprise when one of the females first arrived. No one had any idea that she was pregnant.
All
So
right.
there was a surprise one day when a calf turned up, which amazingly I got to see them all. But yeah, no, it's really fascinating, and it's abundantly clear that they're having an impact. It's really encouraging to see.
Do you think we'll ever see them in kind of loose in the UK, or do you think that we're kind of not quite ready for that?
Um, I don't think the law would permit that,
No.
but yeah, I mean they could be introduced elsewhere. I mean, yeah, there are a number of similar projects around Europe. So the bison that are in Kent, they've come from, I think one of them came from Scotland, if I remember correctly. Definitely one from Germany and Holland. So there are these different captive populations, and obviously they need to be they need to be bred in order to
Yeah.
maintain genetic diversity.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know of any plans, but I'm
No.
sure, it's a possibility.
Yeah, it'll be. I think I've probably the ones in Scotland came from the Highland Wildlife Park, I would guess, because I
Hmm.
saw them there a few years ago, and yeah, they were big. They were big to say the least. They were pretty interesting. Circling back round to the book, what do you think we can learn from the 10 species that we've lost, and to stop repeating it with other species as well?
Yeah, I mean, they each hold lessons,
Yeah.
very different lessons. I mean, tragically, with a lot of extinction stories, you know, they were set in motion a long time ago.
Yeah,
So, one of the most significant things that we've done, negative things we've done to the natural world is essentially to connect different habitats, different biogeographical realms. So whereas naturally, an island, for instance, would be completely isolated from everything around it, and the species that end up adapting to live there are ill-suited to anywhere else in the world. But the moment we connect those habitats with the rest of the world via shipping lanes and just simply by turning up in boats and having rats scurry off our ships and things like that, it can kind of set into motion these these stories that can take centuries to come to a close. So a lot of the time, the challenges are kind of very kind of long standing. But there are always in these stories there were always chances to intervene,
yeah,
chances to change the course of things. And so, with some stories like there's a bird from Hawaii, from the island of Maui called the po'oli, which is a tiny forest bird, and there was a decades long attempt to save this bird, but it was mired with lots of indecision. It was a time when the forest birds of Hawaii weren't really very well understood, so there was lots of hesitation about how much should we get involved? Would these birds even survive in a captive breeding facility? There was the way it's been explained to me by the interviews that I did with experts is essentially there was too much hesitation. And the lesson they learned from failing to save that bird was that they needed to be bold,
yeah,
and that Jim Greenbridge, who was the chap who at one point was leading that rescue attempt, he told me that he tells all his students, because he now teaches conservation biology, he tells them that we need to get stuck in with endangered species and get invasive because there's no one else standing in between these species and extinction. So that's not going to necessarily apply in every instance, but with each story, there are these lessons being learned. And I think one thing that I think is quite encouraging is that, like I said before, it is within our means to change the outcome for endangered species. It is just a matter of will in a lot of cases. And so I think the more people learn about the natural world, the more people talk about the natural world, the more people do things even on a very localized level. I mean, people have been talking about bee-friendly gardens for decades now, but it really makes a difference.
yeah,
As you were talking earlier about the ecosystems being interconnected, that's exactly why those small actions that we can all take can have a dramatic make a dramatic difference. The little patch of flowers that you grow could impact migratory birds that are flying off to Africa and having all kinds of impacts in the ecosystems there. So I think, what was the question?
What
Sorry.
what can we, no, it's okay. It's a long day. It's only half one. What can we learn from these 10 species to stop us repeating it with others?
Yes, I
So,
think,
but no,
yeah.
for your point, I think you're spot on with saying that we need to be bold. I think that, yeah, not to say that we don't need to be scientific and whatever, but at some point you just need to get things done. And there's going to be so many times where people are debating and being bureaucratic, and we just need to get things done. Because, yeah,
Mm,
time, a lot of these species, whether they're extinct or heading that way, that they don't have time on their side, do they?
mm, exactly. Yeah.
So I would agree with that. Are you? I'll leave before we kind of finish. I'll just leave you with an anecdote from the other day. Are you familiar with a fish called a burbot?
Yes.
Okay, so the burbot is a species that we had in the UK up until 1969. That's when the last one was found, and they're still in Europe, but they're extinct in the UK. And I do a lot of like evening talks and lectures and whatnot. And I was at a fishing club in Rutland, and I was talking to an old boy there. He must have been mid 80s, and just chatting about fish, and as you do. And he mentioned burbot, and he says, I remember when I was in his teens, he caught a burbot out of the River Cam, no River Ouse, sorry. And I just thought, Well, that's, and what reminded me of that story is when you said that you were talking to these people who met these animals that went extinct. And I just thought the British version of that is that there are still people alive today who would have seen British burbot. Admittedly, not many because it's getting on a bit, but he was telling me, yeah, I remember catching it and it was wriggling in my hands and then let it go. So yeah, you kind of reminded me of that story. The positive side of that is that we still have burbot on the continent, and we are hopefully going to reintroduce those in Norfolk. I think the plan is they're still at snail's pace, but it is still moving forward. But yeah,
Hmm.
your story reminded me of that anyway.
It's really interesting speaking to people who've had that very unique experience. One in particular was the poley, the bird I was just talking about, the Hawaiian bird. I interviewed a wonderful, wonderful biologist called Tony Casey, who actually was one of the people who discovered it in
Ah,
1973. She was just a student. She was 22 years old. You know, she was up hiking this volcano in Maui with some of her university classmates, and they stumbled into this pristine patch of rainforest that not even the native Hawaiians on Maui had explored or named many of the species living there. And they found this tiny little bird, and obviously, unfortunately, for her, it's really heartbreaking that she then had to witness it going extinct. But it's really important that we preserve those accounts of species that are disappearing.
yeah, yeah, because obviously it is finite. If people want to get hold of the book, Tom, where would you direct them? Where's the best place to go?
You can get it in your local bookshops. Any independent bookshop or Waterstones, bookshop.org. You can, you can get it on Amazon if you don't mind doing that. But I people hate Amazon, but the unfortunate truth about Amazon is that the sales rankings are really vital for authors. It's
Right.
like you have to get into bed with the devil, unfortunately. But
Yeah, necessary
maybe
evil.
I probably shouldn't be slagging off Amazon on this. Anyway, uh,
I don't think Jeff Bezos listens to this,
yeah,
so I think you'll be fine, Tom. Don't worry.
you never know.
I've said a lot worse on this podcast and I've got away with it, so I think you'll be okay. I'll put a link in the description anyway, so maybe a non-Amazon link if people want to go down that route and get the book. But yeah, it's been fascinating. I mean, I can't wait to properly. I've read the first chapter, but I need to get into the rest of the book and find out more about these species. But yeah, thanks for coming on.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for having me. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as you get through it.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
will definitely. Cheers.
brilliant. All right. Thanks very much, Jack.
Really looking forward to reading that. I'm going to Australia soon, so I'll definitely take that book with me to have a little read when I'm on the flight. Now, next week is the penultimate episode of this season. So we're getting back to fish, and next week's episode is going to be all about ruff. So I'm going to be telling you about these amazing little fish. I absolutely love them. They're beautiful, they're underrated, so I'm going to try and sell you guys on the idea of what a ruff is and why you should learn about them. So that'll be next week's episode. This has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.